Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation, Planning and Insights for District 39's Fall Reopening of School. My name is Tony DeMonte, Administrator for Technology and Safety at District 39. I will be your moderator this evening. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Carrie Cremascoli, Superintendent of District 39. I have a few housekeeping items before we begin. First, all microphones are muted for the duration of the presentation. Second, as Dr. Cremascoli is presenting, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A. The Q&A icon is located at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Heather Glowacki, Assistant Superintendent, will be asking your questions at the end as time permits. Third, please know this webinar is being recorded for later viewing. It'll be posted on the district YouTube channel tomorrow. I'm excited to say we have 230 families that are signed in and growing, which likely represents double that number across Wilmette and Glenview, as multiple members of families are sitting together, eager to learn about school reopening plans. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Cremascoli.
Thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate your support of this evening's webinar and our entire team behind us as we share information with our families and hopefully a few of our students too who might be signed in this evening to learn a little bit more about our considerations for planning for the fall. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I know how busy everyone is, and I appreciate your making the time to learn a little bit more about our considerations. I provided the same presentation to our faculty and staff at each of our 6 schools yesterday, and while the information was a bit overwhelming for many, I think most also found it helpful and informative too, so I hope that you will as well. Tony shared a couple of housekeeping items. Again, we are very eager for your feedback, your input, and your questions. We will be accepting questions throughout this evening's presentation, and I will do my best to answer those at the end of our time together. All of those questions will be shared with our planning committee so that they can consider the needs for information and the feedback that is being provided. We will seek your input in a couple of different ways this evening. First, throughout our session, not only are we asking for questions through the Zoom chat, but we'll also be doing a few polls as we progress through this evening. So we invite you to respond to those polls. It will give us an idea of your feedback based on the information we are sharing thus far. So thank you for that. The other really critical way in which we will be gathering information, not only from all of you, but from all of our parents, is through a parent survey that will be sent out to all families tomorrow. You are especially well positioned to respond to that survey because you have the opportunity to review the information that is being shared this evening. So again, that information gathered through the survey will be shared with our planning committee, and they will use that information to really inform their plans and their considerations as we tackle the huge task of planning for this upcoming fall return to school. So thank you so much. Please look out for that survey. Take the time to respond. There's open-ended questions as well as a few multiple choice questions where we're asking you to consider a number of options. Again, we hope that this evening will be very informative. I also must share that ideally, I would not be sitting in front of a screen talking to you at this point. I would much prefer to be in person. Obviously, our current circumstances don't make that possible. I do appreciate so many of you joining us in this modality, and we look forward to gathering again someday, hopefully soon. I also need to share that this evening, we have more unknowns than answers. We continue to receive guidance from many, many agencies, and that guidance will inform our planning for the upcoming school year. Unfortunately, there is much more guidance to be forthcoming. And so this evening, I will walk you through, share with you some of what we know, some of what we don't know, and much of the considerations that need to be made, not only by our school district, but by school districts across Illinois and really across our nation as they plan for the upcoming school year. Finally, I cannot proceed this evening without acknowledging the horrible events that have unfolded, in Minneapolis and across our country this last week. The racism, hate, violence, fear, and aggressive acts are horrific, deplorable, and heartbreaking. My heart and prayers, advocacy, and support are with those who are suffering at this time. District 39 condemns hate and racism in all forms. And we continue to work hard to create school cultures and climates that are inclusive, accepting, respectful, and supportive of all. May we continue to all find ways to come together to denounce racism and hatred in all of its forms, and to create a better future for our communities, for ourselves, for our children, and for all humankind. With that, I am proud to introduce my team who is with me this evening, whose voices you will hear as I speak to you, and they are supporting me behind the scenes. Again, you see my picture there to the left. I'm Dr. Karma Scully. I'm the superintendent here in the Wilmette Public Schools. I have Tony DeMonte with me. He serves as our lead for technology as well as for safety and security throughout our school district. And Dr. Heather Glowacki is with us, and you will hear her voice later in this evening as we approach the questions that you all have submitted. Dr. Glowacki will be the one presenting those questions. We have several other administrators who are working behind the scenes to help Heather sort through all those questions and make sure that they are all asked in every way. With that, I will jump into our presentation. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. As we plan for the fall and our transition to in-person instruction, there are many, many factors for us to consider. And as I mentioned at the start, we do have more answers than we, more unknowns than we have answers at this point. We are continuing to learn each and every day as this pandemic progresses and as the health data informs our next steps, and our government partners continue to help us along the way as well. So I do hope that my presentation this evening will provide you some background on our planning and give you an idea of some of our thinking for the fall. These are our commitments, and in District 39, we have remained committed to a number of areas throughout remote learning. So some of these will be familiar to you. First and foremost is the health and safety of our students and our staff. We cannot progress with teaching and learning if we aren't first considering and planning carefully for the health and safety of our students and our staff. That is what will guide our decisions as we plan for reentry to the next school year, and as we plan to care for and support the learning of each and every student throughout our district. The second thing is that we are committed to remaining flexible and adaptable throughout our planning. We recognize that where our country was, where Wilmette was at the start of this pandemic, when we first made the very difficult decision to close schools, is a different place than we are at now, having lived in social distancing and isolation and progressed through remote learning. We've learned more about the coronavirus. We've learned more about its transmission and ways to protect ourselves. Yet, we also recognize the importance of continuing to move forward. And so we will be flexible and adaptable. Any of the plans that we develop will include plans for what hopefully will involve in-person instruction in the fall, and also the ability to transition to remote learning if health and safety calls for that to be the case. So we plan to build several options and scenarios, and we hope to have the ability to be both consistent and flexible at the same time. And I'll talk through what some of those scenarios look like as we're progressing. The third is continuing to provide teaching and learning that is manageable and meaningful. If you are a parent, maybe even a student in our district, you have heard us talk about making remote learning manageable and meaningful for our students, for our families, and for our teachers. That really is a cornerstone to our continued success. You see I've added here the word sustainable. And as we plan for the upcoming school year, we need to make sure that our programming is sustainable for the long run. We want to make sure that whatever we launch in the fall will be able to be sustained throughout the school year. That takes into consideration sustainability in terms of our finances and our budget, sustainability in terms of the work and the effort put forward by our students and by our staff, and the partnerships with our parents. We recognize that we do not function alone, and we must have the partnership and collaboration of all stakeholders in order to ensure our success. We also need to think about the sustainability of the plans that we're creating. So if we are creating plans that rely on supplies that may or may not be available nationally, that may not be a good plan. It may not be a sustainable plan. And so we need to make sure that whatever plans we develop, we are considering the availability of the products that we need in order to enact that plan. And then finally, staffing is another key consideration for us. In sustainability, we need to make sure that we can sustain staffing to support the programming that we are providing to our students. The fourth commitment, and again, if you're a parent or a student in our district, you've probably heard us talk about this, is making sure that learning is targeted and connected. By targeted, we mean to refer to the learning standards and the work that we are asking of our students. We want to make sure that that work is targeted toward the most important learning at every single grade level and across each content area. By connected, we want to make sure that our learning is connected both across content areas and across learning standards, but also to real life and into the meaningful endeavors that we all act upon. We also, when we refer to connected, we talk about the connections and the relationships that we know are so important to making learning, again, meaningful and relevant within the world today. So building those connections between our teachers and our students, whether they are in school or learning remotely, we have focused tremendously on building those connections, and we will continue to do that as we move forward. We know that our students learn best when they feel connected to their learning, to their school environment, and to their teachers, and that is our commitment. I mentioned early on that we are continuing to receive significant guidance from our state and local authorities. Listed a few that really guide and govern the work that we are trying to accomplish at this point. First and foremost, the state of Illinois and the governor's plan. That really dictates when and if we can return to school in person and what the parameters are there. Second, though, is the Illinois State Board of Education. And the Illinois State Board of Education issues guidance and directives to school districts regarding the ways in which we can return to school, as well as the ways in which we can offer remote learning. So that guidance, hand in hand with the governor's phased plan for reopening, really guides what we are planning. We cannot act against the governor's orders. We cannot act against what the State Board of Education is calling upon us to do. Similarly, we must follow the guidance of the CDC and the Illinois Department of Public Health. Both of those agencies are health experts, and so we rely on their guidance and their assistance in making decisions that help to ensure the health and safety of our students and our staff and our family and community here in Wilmette and in Glenview. We have occasionally heard advocacy for us to take a step outside of the guidance that's been provided either by the governor's office or the Illinois State Board of Education. And at this point, that is not in the best interest of our students and our community as a whole. While we will look for as many opportunities as possible to return to in-person instruction, we must do so safely and with the health and safety of our students and staff in mind. The other organizations that you see listed here are organizations that we collaborate with regularly. Our government partners are key to our success as well. New Trier Township school districts are collaborating on a daily basis. Sometimes I'm on calls with superintendents multiple times a day, talking through what our learning program looks like, what our collective needs are, and how we can best support our community. We not only share many students and families, but we also recognize that many of our staff members work in and partner with those other districts. And so our collective effort is really meant to support the students and families that we all collectively serve. We learn from each other, we collaborate with each other, we share resources and ideas. And so while you will see some similarities across our programs, they won't be exactly the same. The Wilmette community is slightly different than the Winnetka community and the Glencoe community and the Kenilworth community. And we have different opportunities, different needs, different resources. Our school buildings are slightly different and our staffing is slightly different as well. Our instructional programming also is different across school districts. So that causes us to need to really keep in mind what is best for our students while we are also benefiting from that collective collaboration. The Village of Wilmette and the other government partners in Wilmette are also important to our success. Police, fire, park, and library districts all regularly collaborate with us to ensure, again, the health and safety of our students and of our schools and of our community as a whole. We also partner with Glenview in so much as we have some families who live in Glenview and participate in our district. We're happy to have them. While all of our buildings exist within Wilmette, Glenview is a critical partner for us as well, and we're happy to have really close partnerships, especially with the libraries of Glenview. So thank you to them. And then finally, we do have regional offices of education that help to guide the work of local school districts. With that, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the instructional models we're considering for the fall return to school. We know what in-person instruction looked like pre-pandemic, meaning before the pandemic hit back on March 1st. We know what in-person instruction looked like. We recognize that right now, within the pandemic and with the health restrictions that guide our work, we likely will not return to in-person instruction in the same way, the same modality that it was provided on March 1st. We really need to carefully consider how and in what way we can return to in-person instruction. On the other end of that spectrum is remote learning, and that's what we've been doing over the last 2 months. We have benefited from the hard work of our students and our staff, and we have benefited from the close partnership and hard work of our families too, who have been grappling with so much at home while supporting the remote learning of their children. So thank you for that. We recognize that either of those two options may be at play as we re-enter school in the fall. We also recognize that there may be a hybrid model that could be at play. And many school districts across the state are starting to examine what options exist for a hybrid model. In-person instruction in all its forms would require large groups of students, in our case, 400, 500, sometimes 900 students converging on one building and sharing common space, intermixing throughout the day. Oftentimes there's 23 or 24, sometimes up to 30 students within one classroom, and throughout their day they are changing environments. Right now, that kind of convergence of people is not possible. We've heard the governor's orders in his phased approach to reopening, allowing for groups of 10. We've also heard the CDC guiding the reopening of schools to require 6 feet of distance, plus a lot of PPE and additional equipment to make returning to school possible. 6 feet of distance for a classroom that is expected to serve 23 students is not physically possible to make arrangements within that one classroom to serve all 23 students with 6 feet apart at the exact same time. So we have to look at some hybrid models that might allow for some personal connection between our teachers and our students in person, but also rely upon remote learning to supplement and support that, those opportunities. So let me stretch into what our hybrid models might look like. There are 4 that seem to be gaining the greatest attention, not only in our district, but across the state of Illinois as potentials that districts are exploring for the start of the upcoming school year. The first that you see on your screen is alternating days. And this means exactly what I'm sure you would imagine it to mean. Every other day, different students would be on campus receiving in-person instruction, and on their off days, they would be home participating through remote learning. Again, by reducing the number of students who are on campus, we're able to meet the guidelines, or we hope we would be able to meet the guidelines set forth by the CDC for reopening schools, and what we expect to be set forth by the ISB in terms of number of students within a classroom and the protections that will be necessary in order for us to bring students back on campus. The same is true about alternating weeks. Maybe half of our students will be in school for 1 week, and then the other will be home engaging in remote learning, and then we will switch. And the other half of the students will come to school in person while others are home. Another model that many districts are exploring would take into account a half-day approach or partial days. In this model, students would come for a portion of their day to receive some of their instruction, and again, it would be supplemented by remote learning at home. It may involve a morning group and an afternoon group with supplemental remote learning at home. It may involve groups of students coming in for a portion of their small group instruction. Often you hear about our reading groups that happen in our elementary school classrooms. So could it be possible that students would come in for a small group of reading instruction and a small group of math instruction, and might otherwise be practicing and continuing their learning through remote learning at home? Sorting through the logistics of that, that is one other option that we are looking at and exploring. And then finally, some kind of rotation by grade level or otherwise, a designation of students, and then determining, do they alternate weeks or alternate days? The best example that I have been able to come up with so far within our district might be at WJHS, where we serve 7th graders and 8th graders, and we have a team model to our instruction. Might it be possible that 7th graders come on one day, 8th graders come on the other, and we can socially distance appropriately so that all students have access to some in-person instruction? Alternatively, we could take a teams approach and have certain teams come on some days and other teams come on other days. Again, as we are going through these models, we must make sure in our planning that we are flexible, adaptable, and that all of our programming remains connected across these options, because we recognize that there may be a need to transition from one to another throughout the school year as health conditions unfold and as guidance is provided by the experts. So this leads us to our first polling question, and I believe Tony DeMonte is going to help me get this polling question up for all of you. We're looking for some feedback on the manageability of these options. Again, recognizing that full in-person instruction every single day, as we experienced in early March, would be the ideal for everyone. Trust me when I say, on behalf of our staff and our administrators, it is our ideal as well. Until we can get there, until we're allowed to experience that again, we need to explore some of these other options, and we need to know what could be manageable within our community and for our parents and our students. So we're going to ask a question now. Tony, do you put this up for us?
I will be, yes. For those attendees, we're going to present you a question. I'll read the question and answers, and then we will share the results when we are done. So here we are for question number 1. Go ahead and vote at any time. If we created a school schedule in which students were able to partially return to school, adhering to all health guidelines and restrictions and social distancing, which of the following would be most manageable for your family? Alternating days of in-person learning, alternating weeks of in-person learning, partial days of in-person learning, none. A hybrid model will not work for our family. Please go ahead and vote accordingly. Right now we have about 50% of the attendees voting, 60%, 70%. We will end the poll as soon as that number gets a bit higher. 80% voted.
I will mention we have 300 families tuned in right now. That is simply amazing. Thank you all for giving of your time this evening to learn a little more.
Okay, we're almost at 90%. Get those last couple answers there. And I'll go ahead and end the poll. and I'm going to share the results. As you can see, we had 40% voting alternating days of in-person learning, followed by alternating weeks, followed by partial days, and none as the final.
Thank you so much. As you can see, there is quite a bit of variance when we ask what is ideal, what is most manageable in terms of these hybrid models. We ask the same question of our teachers as they're thinking about teaching and learning and supporting the needs of their students. We ask them to weigh in on what would be the most manageable instructional model to approach. And their results were quite similar to yours. In fact, I think they were pretty evenly spread across, last time I checked, across all 4 categories. Some recognizing that a hybrid model will be very challenging for many, and others recognizing that partial days would be wonderful. There are some logistical challenges there. Alternating days or alternating weeks certainly seems to be gathering quite a bit of support. And so again, now I'm going to start talking about some of the considerations. And as we can walk through all these considerations, keep in your head what this might look like if we're doing a hybrid approach and how the logistics might work out. Are you ready, Tony? I'm still seeing the polling question on my screen, so I'm going to X out of that and see if I can. That's
Go
okay.
ahead and X out. I should have closed the polling, so
okay.
It's not showing for me.
All right.
There we go.
So families, these are the considerations we are making as a district. And what we have attempted to do as an administrative team is take all the information that we are receiving in terms of guidance from our health experts and from our governmental partners and from our colleagues, all those different areas and bits of considerations that we need to make. And we have been able to organize them into what you see here, which is 12 specific areas of consideration. And then some additional items too, and I'll talk about those when we get there. But those 12 areas, you'll see there's some gradation to the color green, and that is done purposefully because we took all these 12 and we reorganized them into 3 key areas with the hope that our summer planning committee then will organize itself into subcommittees to really dig into each of these 3 overarching areas where these considerations will be made. And again, a note at the bottom is listed here. Guidance from and collaboration with our state and local authorities is absolutely critical as we make these decisions. So this is the image we've been using with our staff to help them to understand and help guide the work that we are doing together. There is the key area of health and safety, under which we are making considerations for the health and well-being of students and staff, for the social emotional needs, learning, and supports that must be in place, for PPE availability and viability, and for our sanitation procedures. That all falls under health and safety, and at the next several slides, I'll kind of walk through what each of those categories mean. In the second area of consideration, we are looking at school operations and logistics. And this is a mountain for us. If you are someone who has ever worked in a school, you probably understand the complex environment in which we work and support all the little beings who come to us and eager to learn and eager to connect with their peers and with their teachers. So there's a lot to consider here. Our focus here will be on physical restrictions for social distancing. Again, we are getting a ton of guidance in this regard. Some of it is shifting. Some of it seems as though there are certain guidance that comes out from the governor's office, and then the CDC has offered some other guidance for planning to reopen schools. Again, we expect ISB to come out with additional guidance, hopefully sometime this week, so we can use that in our planning. This group will also be looking at weekly and yearly school calendars, extracurricular programming, and food services, transportation, arrival, and dismissal procedures. Again, these are really significant. That final category is really our bread and butter. When we are in education, teaching and learning is what we always want to be talking about and what we are most focused on. At this point, we recognize that we cannot focus on teaching and learning if we don't first care for the health and safety of our students and our families and our staff, and take into consider the school operations and logistics that will support teaching and learning. Yet we recognize that teaching and learning is the most important work that we do with our students. And so this group will really be focused on instructional planning. They'll be looking at all of those models in from an instructional lens, trying to evaluate what might work and what might not work. They'll be considering the school day schedule. They'll be looking at curriculum, instruction, and assessment planning. We know that this fourth quarter has been unusual for our students and for our teachers. We recognize we need to make some adjustments as we enter into fall, and this group will really be digging in there. And then finally, professional development for our teachers and for our staff. So the next several slides, I'll walk you through each one of these categories and give you an idea of some of the things that we need to think about here. And again, we'll have a couple of polls as we go through. Health and well-being of students and staff, again, critically important, not only in light of the pandemic, but always. We must consider the health and well-being of our students and staff. This refers to health and safety, and right now we're really critically concerned about the coronavirus, but there are so many elements within operating a school that we must consider as we build out our plans for the fall. We have to think about the mental health and intellectual well-being of our students as well as of our staff. Are they mentally and emotionally available for learning and intellectually, academically ready to take on that next step in their learning? We need to think about vulnerable populations, and for us, that includes our students as well as our staff. There are medical vulnerabilities throughout our community, those who maybe are susceptible or at greater risk for the coronavirus or for other medical conditions that might put them at greater risk. And then there are some age restrictions that we understand place some individuals in a higher risk category related to the coronavirus. Again, all of those factors need to be considered as we build out our plans. Special education needs and services must be considered as well. And some of our special education students require critical health and care as they enter our schools and as they progress throughout their school day. So we need to consider that. We need to consider some of the limitations for grade levels. And the other thing in terms of the coronavirus that we're really keyed into right now is how can we manage symptoms checks for our staff and for our students? As we recognize and as we've learned, temperature is one of those factors that really is an indication of the possibility of infection. And so we are being advised to consider ways in which we can monitor temperatures of students and of staff as they enter our buildings to try to limit the risk of infection. We also need to think about the interruptions and ongoing adjustments. If a teacher who is responsible for a group of 23 or 24 students becomes ill, what are our plans in order to continue to support those students in their learning, whether it's remote or a hybrid approach? How can we support that? Substitute teaching happens a little bit differently in each of these environments. And again, ever being flexible. We have fortunately gotten a jump start on some of these things, partially because the guidance around health and safety for coronavirus has been pretty consistent for us. And so we do expect as we return to school that all individuals will be required to wear masks on school site. We are prepared for and are have already made an order for the face shields that you see, something like, not exactly like the picture that you see on your screen, but we expect our staff members will be wearing some kind of a washable and reusable mask coupled with a face shield to provide extra protection for them as well as for their students whom they're serving. We have ordered what you see there are colored barriers that students will use at their desks, again, as a sneeze guard and an additional barrier for them between their peers and between them and their teacher as well. Again, just an additional layer of protection that can be wiped down and sanitized. And then what you see on the far right is a device that will help us to monitor temperatures as individuals are coming into the school environment. We need to be thinking about thermometers and how those will work as we welcome 200, 300, possibly 500 students into the building and staff members as well. We need to do so efficiently and effectively. And so we are putting into place some of the PPE that we know will be necessary to support us. We must consider the social and emotional needs and supports for our students and for our staff. We have a committee that has been working on social emotional curriculum instruction and making adjustments there for the last 2 years. That work is ongoing, but we also recognize that in light of this long extended period of being home and remote learning and some traumatic experiences that some of our students and families have endured during this time, that we may need to provide some targeted emotional supports as students return to school. And we also recognize those transition supports for return to school are really critical this year. We always plan for the start of the school year and kind of resetting with our students, our expectations and how we support them at school. This year is no different, but will be heightened because students have simply been out of school for so long and out of large group environments. And so we must continue to care for and support that. School culture and climate, as I spoke early on in my welcome, has been a critical element for us. We've really been focused here in Wilmette on building school cultures in school climates that support all who are at our schools to feel connected and engaged in our work, students and staff alike. That's an important element that we must continue. And it looks a little different when you're in a remote learning environment than when you're in person for instruction. And so we must plan for how we're continuing that really important work and providing professional development for our staff. I spoke a little about PPE. This group, looking at health and safety, will really examine what is the viability of masks and of gloves. They'll be thinking about thermometers and the other health and safety equipment that might support our work. They'll also need to consider the national supply chain and availability. So the best example of this is if our plan was to provide all students with masks, can we get enough masks to provide to them? And what happens when a student loses them? Will we be able to replace those? If we're to go with disposable masks, can we rely upon the supply chain and ensure that we'll be able to get those? Or should we instead be looking at individuals supplying those masks, and what might that look like? We also need to think about the unique student needs and limitations. Is it reasonable to expect kindergartners to maintain face coverings the entire day while they're at school? If they're not able to, either developmentally it's not appropriate, or they may have some special needs that prevent them from tolerating that, what supports can we put in place, or what options can we make available? We have many students across our district who have unique needs, and all of those must be considered, along with the cost, availability, and again, sustainability of whatever options we develop. And then finally, sanitation procedures are critically important. We have some good plans in place for this already. We have an incredibly hardworking custodial team and buildings and grounds team. And yet, as we return to school, we recognize that we must plan for daily, weekly, and targeted cleaning as incidents arise. What kind of cleaning must be in place as groups switch from environment to environment, and might it be possible to even do so? How do we clean and ensure the safety within our washrooms and our common areas in any large group spaces? We need to think about hand washing and hand sanitizing. And within a school environment, the stakes are even higher because we serve so many students and so many individuals who might have allergens, and we must be sensitive to those allergies and make sure that whatever we're using for our sanitation procedures takes into account and considers those allergens. As many of you know, our schools are not air conditioned across all schools and across all classrooms. That presents a challenge each fall and sometimes in spring as well, where temperatures rise and it really does become a challenge for us to continue instruction. In this fall, it's even heightened beyond that because we know that air quality, circulation, and climate control has an impact on the transmission of the coronavirus. And so we need to be thinking about and carefully considering how we adjust for that. We also need to think about non-student and non-staff access to our buildings. In all likelihood, as we launch the fall, we will be limiting access to our buildings to only students and staff members beyond a certain threshold, so that we are trying to maintain that clean environment for our students and hopefully continuing in-person instruction for as long as we possibly can. And that brings us to our next polling question. Now that you've learned a little about the health and safety considerations that we need to make as a school district, guided by the CDC, we have a question for you related to your comfort level in returning to in-person instruction. Tony, I'll let you talk the group through that.
Sure. Launching the poll. Reopening schools for in-person instruction may require students and teachers to wear masks, daily temperature checks, and limited movements throughout the classroom and school. How comfortable would you be in allowing your child to participate in person? Absolutely. Even under these extreme circumstances, we want in-person learning. Somewhat, though not ideal, we would make this work for our family. Probably not. This likely will not work for our family, and we likely would not choose to send our children to in-person school. No way. This is not the learning environment in which I would be comfortable with my child participating. Right now, we're at about 45% having voted, 55%, 70%, approaching 80%. Our first question, we got up to 90%. So let's see if we're at 85%. And we're getting closer. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. A few more seconds here. All right, ending the poll. And I'm going to share the results. Looks like 50% of you voted somewhat, though not ideal. We would make this work for our family. Followed by absolutely, followed by probably not, followed by no way. I'll give you a second here to just review that. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you again for that feedback. Again, each family situation is different, and we must take into consideration all of those different needs while also planning for as many students as we possibly can and making adjustments in support of teaching and learning. I'm moving in now to school operations and logistics, and I've touched on a couple of these things as I've already been talking, so I will move a little more quickly through some of these, making sure that I'm reserving some time for questions at the end. The school operations and logistics team will be carefully considering physical restrictions for social distancing, and I spoke of these early on. We know that the CDC is guiding us to make arrangements for students to remain 6 feet apart while they're at school. So if you can envision a classroom with desks 6 feet apart, most classrooms can accommodate 12 to 15 students if that's a little bit larger classroom. So if that is the restriction, we will aim to meet that restriction, and then we have to figure out how many students can we have on campus and in class at one time. We have to think about, and we may get some guidance regarding the number of students who can be in our buildings at one time. WJHS is a very large building and serves 900 students. We have to really be thinking about how do we accommodate all of those students within the school. Space limitations of our physical buildings is one of those considerations. As we're thinking about bodies and we're thinking about space, how can we adjust for that? Classroom arrangements, communal shared spaces, hallway configurations. If we have students walking through hallways, are they going to be able to maintain 6 feet of distance? What do we do about lunch and recess? These are really perplexing challenges, especially when you think about young 5, 6, 7-year-olds. What about specials? And as students go to and from PE class, where they likely will encounter an environment where many students on a typical day would have entered that environment and left. We need to think about substitute staff and how we coordinate for them. Supervision and transportation, all of these are factors that fall into play as we're building out the operations and logistics for our district. This would lead us then to looking at those weekly and yearly schedules. Again, alternating schedules, what might that look like? We've considered earlier or later starts to the school year, and quite frankly, there are benefits and drawbacks to each of those options. At this point, we expect the start date for school to remain the same. We don't see a tremendous benefit at this point of pushing the start date back or moving forward the start date. Staggering start times, even in so much as just needing to support students as they're transitioning into school, and maintaining social distance may require some staggered start and end times. Do we need to shorten our days in order to accommodate the kinds of instruction that needs to happen? And what happens with partial days? We also need to think about institute days, and in the parent events, we have curriculum night coming up. Typically by now we would have already had most of those dates completely planned out, and we know what that structure looks like. Right now we anticipate having some challenges bringing parents onto campus for a curriculum night. We have to look at food services, transportation, and arrival and dismissal procedures. Many of you know we are very proud of our food service here in Wilmette. We work really hard to provide clean options, healthy options, and delicious options for our students across all of our schools. Will that still be a viable option as we enter into fall? Where will students eat in order to maintain proper social distancing? And then what does that look like as we support our families? Same thing with transportation. We do offer some transportation in our district, and many families take advantage of that. If you're attempting to social distance on a bus, that requires many more buses and many more routes with fewer students on every bus. Is that reasonable? Can we accomplish that and do so efficiently and effectively for students? This group will also look at extracurricular programming. We know for many of our students, this is a really important part of their school career and their school connections. We don't want to lose all of those programs, and yet we recognize that things again will look a little bit different. Can we do small group gatherings with some restrictions? Can we offer athletics and jazz band and some of those large group extracurricular clubs that are so important to so many students? And what happens with our before and after school care programs and clubs? We know that those will need to be restricted to our students only, but beyond that, will we be able to continue with that programming in support of our students and our families? So this leads us to polling question number 3. I'm going to ask Tony to bring that up. As you think about these school operations and logistics and the physical restrictions for social distancing, we want a little feedback from you.
Okay, launching the poll. Social distancing may require desks 6 feet apart, no large groups, students remaining with a single classroom, except for outdoors, and few group changes with teachers moving between rooms. How comfortable would you be allowing your child to participate? Absolutely. Even under these extreme circumstances, we want in-person learning. Somewhat, though not ideal, we would make this work for our family. Probably not. This likely will not work for our family, and we likely would not choose to send our children to in-person school. No way, this is not the learning environment in which I would be comfortable with my children participating. Looks like we're at about 70% of you that have voted. We will probably never have 100% of you voted, as some of you called in versus joining us on your phone or laptop or tablet. We're almost at 90%, which seems to be about our participation rate, and we're going to end the poll. Last few clicks, please. Ending poll and sharing results. So 47% of you said absolutely. Even under these extreme circumstances, we want in-person learning, followed by somewhat, followed by probably not, followed by no way. I'm going to go ahead, give you a second or two to review that and stopping the share.
And I will mention that feedback is really important to us. It helps us to understand the comfort level of our parents. These questions will also be presented in a little bit different way on the survey as we launch that tomorrow to all families. It will look a little different at a K-4 level than it will look at the 6-8 level. Obviously, on our middle school and junior high campus, students transition from classroom to classroom. It's very common for students every 40 minutes or so to be standing up and moving to another classroom. The logistics of not doing that becomes really much more challenging at our middle school and junior high school than it might at our elementary schools. And so again, the model might look a little different from one level to the other. I want to talk a little about teaching and learning. First and foremost, that instructional model planning is at the forefront of the work of this subcommittee. Trying to plan for some consistency across the entire year, being flexible possibly between remote and in-person instruction, depending on the guidance and the health conditions that are in front of us at that point. A hybrid model may help support some of that. We need to look at maybe making some adjustments to our remote learning expectations. If we are to pursue remote learning, even at any point within the school year, how can we make adjustments there? And we need to think not only about general education, we have to think also about specials in our rotational courses. We need to think about our intervention and support services that are so critical for our students, and then special education, and how does that fold into our instructional model planning? Really, really critical considerations. I offer this image just to give you something to kind of think about. For us, we have our elementary schools, which are pre-K through 4th grade, and that model may look slightly different than what we're offering at our 5th through 8th grade campus, where students, again, transition between teams and between courses from environment to environment. A model that might work at our elementary schools might not work as well on our 5-8 campus. And then layer on top of that all the special education needs and services that we must also consider. We are deeply committed in Wilmette to ensuring the inclusion and participation of students across our general education environment, and we must continue to support the needs of all students. And so our special education service providers must be a critical part of these considerations as we plan for how we're delivering not only core instruction, but the specials and the related arts too. So they'll be looking at the school day schedule. These are just some areas that we need to really consider. What happens with our alternate days? Teacher planning and prep time is critically important to ensuring that the learning that is happening for students is targeted and meaningful. We need to think across all of these areas and then consider how do we staff for the programs, not only in person, but also for those who may need or require remote learning. Our curriculum instruction and assessment department has been really busy at work throughout remote learning and will continue to be as we plan for the fall reopening. We recognize we need to make some adjustments in our curriculum and in the learning standards based on what students have accomplished this spring. And as we plan for the fall, we will meet our students where they're at and help each and every one grow. We already have plans in place for next week, teachers to be spending some time digging into the learning standards, talking about what has been accomplished and what the next steps in learning are for our students, doing some vertical articulation as well. We've taken a step away from formal assessments in the remote learning environment, and regardless of the modality in which we're providing instruction in the fall, we must fold assessment in a formal way back into our planning so that our teachers have guidance on those next steps in learning, but also that parents and students know where they're progressing and what might come next in their learning path. We have to plan for the instructional supports and interventions and for the learning platforms. And so some of our students might be familiar with Schoology, others might be familiar with other tools that support communication. Those learning applications and resources are under examination. And then looking at how can we continue to support skills practice and reinforcement as well. Again, across modalities, we need to make sure that the teachers have at their fingertip the tools that they need. We also have to think about professional development, and this is not only for the remote learning environment or whichever instructional model that we are implementing, but we had already laid out plans for social and emotional needs and learning that were to be implemented throughout next school year. We're now making some adjustments to what that professional development looks like in light of the pandemic and in light of reopening our schools and transitioning back. Our teachers need support to best support our students. I mentioned that ongoing school culture and climate work, and that will continue to be critical work within our district, and we want that professional development to continue. We also have new curricular resources. Every year we're adopting new resources and keeping our materials fresh. The one that probably is at the forefront of most people's minds is the science and STEM resources, but we need to keep that professional development ongoing. We also have traditionally just planned for long-range professional development. We have already planned for the township-wide Professional Development Institute Day next year in February, and will we still be able to continue with that? What adjustments do we need to make there? These are the additional items. So I've kind of talked you through the considerations that we need to make in order to plan. We have a summer committee of teachers and administrators who will be digging into these logistics and really examining what will be possible within our schools and best for our students in terms of each of these three categories. We also are seeking stakeholders from across our district, parents, teachers, administrators, community members who will be able to serve on our advisory task force. That task force is going to be working hand in hand with our summer committee to really guide their work, to provide feedback, and to refine their thinking as they progress through the summer. We will be sending out information over the next week for parents to apply to be part of the advisory task force. I mentioned surveys. We've done a survey of our staff after each of these presentations that happened with them. Tomorrow, you'll get a survey as parents to respond to and help guide this work. And we're also looking for some ways to survey some of our students, hopefully before they leave for their summer break. I want to mention summer school and jumpstart to fall opportunities are still available. Registration for that continues until the 6th. So please check your email or look at our website. There's information there. Again, for summer, it will be remote learning at this point. We haven't yet been given the go sign to move forward with in-person instruction. Jumpstart really will give our students the opportunity to get their brains working again in a 2-week condensed version of what will help them to focus on academics as they get ready to return to school. Throughout this all, you've heard me talk about sustainability. The financial impact of this is immense, and we must consider the costs and make sure that whatever plans we're developing are sustainable. And so that's at the forefront of our minds. Finally, in terms of timeline for decision making, I wish I had all the answers right now. We don't even yet have all the guidance that must inform our planning. And so we expect additional guidance to be coming to us over the next several weeks. Then the planning team will be working throughout the end of June and July developing plans. We will continue to keep our families apprised of the progress of the committee and the advisory task force, but we do not expect to have an answer on what school will look like in the fall until the end of July at the earliest. I know most of our families and I know our students would love to have that information sooner, but the situation is constantly changing. And so we must allow ourselves time to adjust to that and to build out plans again that will be sustainable for the long run. So we will, and we remain committed to keeping our families informed of the planning progress. And if we can make decisions sooner, we certainly will. In summary, these are our 4 areas of commitment. These are our instructional model scenarios that we will be examining and planning for across a continuum, making sure that we are flexible, adaptable, and connected throughout our programming. And these are all those 12 areas of consideration targeted within the 3 target areas that our summer planning team will be working on and our advisory task force will be advising on. With that, we've arrived at our final polling question. And meanwhile, I know that Dr. Glowacki and our other support administrators are reviewing those questions that you have been submitting. So while we turn to this polling question, please know that they are preparing those questions so that they can present those to me as well. Tony, the 4th polling question?
Yep, launching the poll. We have a lot to consider as we plan for the upcoming school year. With all that has been shared and knowing all the current guidelines and restrictions in effect, please indicate your preference for the start of the 2020-21 school year. Modified in-person instruction, a hybrid model of in-person and remote learning, or continued remote learning. Please make your selection. We're at 50%. 65%, 80%. Give it a few more seconds to get to that 90% mark. We're almost there, about to end the poll. Last few clicks. And ending poll.
Wow.
Results are being shared. It looks like modified in-person instruction at 54% of you had the highest vote, followed by a hybrid model of in-person remote learning, followed by continued remote learning.
So interesting to see that feedback. So we really appreciate that. Of course, we all hope to return to in-person instruction, and I appreciate the recognition that even if it's modified and looks drastically different than it did on March 1st, there is interest in returning to that in-person instruction to the greatest extent possible. And a hybrid model seems to be another avenue of interest. So 41% of families saying that they would prefer a hybrid model of in-person and remote learning really helps to inform the work that we're doing. So thank you so much for that. And with that, we have arrived at our questions portion of this evening's webinar. We have about 15 minutes to talk through several questions, and I know, Heather, that you have received many. So I stand prepared to try to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Kremascoli. We have received many questions and many comments, and we've tried to group them to address as many as possible in the next several minutes. The first question, will parents have a choice in sending the children to school for in-person instruction or continuing with remote learning this fall?
Wow, that's an excellent question. The reality is we would love to provide as much choice as possible. We recognize that families are facing a variety of situations, both personally and professionally. And for some families, whether it be because of their personal or professional circumstances or a health condition, they may want to make that choice. We hope to be able to provide those choices. Again, we have to sort through the logistics of how to manage all of this to be able to allow for that. Ultimately, if a student has a health condition that requires them to remain at home, we already have procedures in place that will allow for and accommodate that and provide some homebound instruction to them. The bigger question is, can we allow families to choose remote learning over whatever model of in-person instruction we have designed? That becomes a question of logistics and a question of staffing. Can we use our staff in such a way that we can provide remote learning and also provide in-person instruction in a sustainable way? So we will be looking at that. We do hope to provide some options to families, but we have to do so in a sustainable way.
Great. The next question, if the district's reopening plans include in-person learning and there is an increase in those infected with the virus, how will the district respond?
Again, another great question. And first and foremost, we will be guided by the CDC and the IDPH in terms of our next steps. We have throughout this process been guided by them and their work and best practice in health and safety. If it became, if the scenario were that infection rates increased, we would need to consider the option to return to remote learning. My expectation would be that the CDC and the IDPH, what I know of their guidance thus far, may require that of us. But again, we would be really carefully considering how we can avoid that as best we can, and then what options we need to have in place in the event that that happens if it's out of our control. Not only do we need to be thinking about a potential spike in the infection rate, but we also need to think about what happens if one individual within a classroom is infected and tests positive. Does that entire class then need to self-quarantine, or can the class continue to engage in in-person instruction and that one individual has to self-quarantine? Again, the guidance from the CDC and the IDPH will really inform our decisions there. It is incumbent upon us to make sure that we have plans in place to react and respond to each of those scenarios that we can pretty well anticipate at this point.
This next question is a two-part question. A hybrid model for teaching and learning could mean that students are not in school every day or for the full day. How will you align school schedules so that all students within a family have the same schedule? And are there plans for childcare support either through District 39 or the Park District?
Wow, You all have some really excellent questions. So the first part of the question is, how will we align across families? And the reality is we will do our very best to make sure, if we are on a rotational schedule, especially a rotational schedule that might involve 1 week on and 1 week off, to align those schedules so that families remain connected and can support one another while they're home, while they're away from school. That said, the reality is, if we're looking at smaller transitions, a day-to-day alteration, that may become more logistically challenging. And certainly if we're going with a hybrid model that would include a half day in the morning and a half day in the afternoon, or small group instructional models, then it becomes that much more difficult to arrange for and coordinate those family schedules. So again, many of the models that we're looking at might allow for some sort of family connection, and we would hope to be able to include that and make sure that we're planning for it to the greatest extent possible. Certainly within a school, it may be more difficult, again, as we think about our elementary school students in their schedule, and then what might be possible at our 5A campus. The second part of your question related to before and after school care programs. And at this point, that again is yet to be determined. If we can return to in-person instruction and if we can relaunch before and after school programming, we absolutely are committed to doing so. We have a close partnership with our park district. In all likelihood, those programs would only be available to students within the school. So some of our elementary schools have enrichment clubs that operate after school. And if we can do so safely, we would love to have those continue. Again, we have to adhere to the restrictions of social distancing and the health guidelines as well. The same is true for childcare. We do have some offerings before school in our schools, and in some after school as well. And again, if we can do so safely and make sure that students remain safe and that the staff supporting them remain safe, we absolutely would hope to do so.
Thank you. The next question, what are some of the adjustments and challenges you are considering for transportation and food services?
Oh my, it's mind-blowing to think about cafeterias. If you've ever been in an elementary school cafeteria and you see the organized chaos that we know and love, it is really hard to imagine how students would be able to, again, 5, 6, 7-year-olds access the cafeteria, get their lunch, and remain social distance while they're there. And then we also have to think about food safety, which for us tends to be a line, a buffet line of sorts, where many people are crossing the same location. So we really need to think about that. One of the things that we will be carefully considering is prepackaged meals, so brown bag lunches, for lack of a better word, that would be available and don't require the same line processing that are currently in place right now. Again, we know that many really value the healthy nature of the food that we've provided. We may need to make some adjustments there in the short term in order to make sure that things are healthy for our students. Transportation is a whole nother challenge. We currently run our transportation, most buses run full every day. And in order to continue to transport students and provide that through busing, we would need to be able to social distance all the students on the bus, which means there would be routes running and running and running. Whether or not we can do that safely and effectively and efficiently is still a question that is yet to be determined. There has not been a whole lot of guidance come out yet by health agencies or by our governmental partners regarding transportation on buses, on school buses. And so we await that guidance in order to do our planning there.
All right. The next question, if remote learning continues at the start of the school year, can we expect changes in learning expectations for students since there will be more time to prepare and plan for this type of instruction?
Yes, I think at this point we have a pretty strong model of remote learning, and yet we recognize it is not perfect and there is room for improvement. We jumped into remote learning very quickly with little planning, and yet have been able to make some really valued adjustments throughout our time in remote learning. we do plan to continue to move forward with those adjustments. We will be looking at our use of gray days and whether those continue to make sense as the school year opens. We'll be looking at the learning standards. We need to look at assessment. We need to look at feedback that we're providing to our students. And above all else, for those who are in a remote learning environment, how are we communicating with them? And so the tools that we use to accomplish all of those tasks are critically important. We have already identified one tool that we will be using across our district. It's called Scoop Pad, which is kind of a silly name for a really cool tool. Some of our students piloted a little bit this year, but it involves connecting students with some learning that is dynamic and that allows them to progress based on how they have responded to earlier learning tasks. And so while this would not replace in any way the skill and expertise of our teachers, it may help to supplement some of what they're doing. And we are excited about integrating that into our remote learning plan or our in-person plan. It is a tool that could be used across environments.
Dr. Glowacki, it's Tony DeMonte here. Just looking at the time and making sure we stay on target. I think we have time for one or two more questions at most. We're approaching 8:15. So if you can go ahead and just ask one or two more and we'll end for the evening.
I'm going to plead for two more questions.
Okay.
The next question, we had many questions around asking about students who have disabilities or have individualized education plans or IEPs, and what consideration we're giving to students with this type of unique learning needs that may have struggled a bit with remote learning.
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. We recognize that our students with special needs and who are served through IEPs have struggled probably the most through remote learning. These are students who rely heavily upon the support and services of many professionals within our school environment in order to access curriculum and benefit from instruction. And so as we plan for the fall, there will be thoughtful and careful consideration made for how we are implementing IEPs. What services can we make available to families, whether it is in person or through remote learning? How can we support the needs of our students throughout those modalities? And while this year we launched remote learning and made as many accommodations and provided as many supports as we possibly could, as we look to the fall, we recognize that we need to make further considerations in that realm in particular. How are related services being provided to our students? Social work services, speech and language pathology services, OT and PT services, all of those are really difficult to provide within a remote learning environment. And so it's part of the consideration as we approach in-person instruction. How can we ensure that those services and supports are available?
Thank you. As we come to a close tonight, the polling questions presented were intended to gather a sampling of opinions. Dr. Cremascoli, can you share more about how you will be gathering and utilizing survey information from families about these very important topics?
Absolutely. So I really appreciate so many people signing in tonight so that they can have a context to the questions that we need to ask our families. We will make this recorded webinar available to all families, and we hope that many more will sign in when they're available and watch this so that they also have the context. But either way, we will be sending the same survey out. It may be in two separate forms, those who have watched the webinar and those who haven't. Those who haven't watched the webinar might get a little more context within those questions. But the bottom line is that survey will be going out to all families, and we will be gathering that feedback not only from our families, our parents and guardians, but again, also from our staff, and we hope from our students as well. We administratively will be using that to guide our planning for the summer committee work, and then the summer committee will be having access to that information and will be carefully reviewing all the input that is provided through those surveys as they continue to plan for the upcoming school year. There may be the opportunity that we need more feedback as we are working through our plans over the summer, and if that becomes the case, again, we plan to continue to keep families updated on the progress, and we certainly would look for additional feedback if there's a need for that. But the advisory task force will be constructed in such a way that we expect it to be a representative sampling of all stakeholders across our district, and so we really will rely heavily on them to help guide our work there as well. Thank you for those questions. Fantastic questions. And I know there are many, many more. All of those questions will be submitted to our administrative team and the planning committee so that we can carefully consider the need for information and the feedback as we build out our plans. Again, the survey will be sent out likely tomorrow, but certainly within this week, so you all can respond to that. Thank you so much. There will be open-ended questions there. We look forward to receiving your feedback and really reviewing that. Follow-up communications, look for this week, the parent survey, a link to the recorded webinar. Please encourage your friends to watch if they weren't able to join us tonight, an application to the Summer Advisory Task Force, and probably some reminders of summer school if you want to sign up. And then over the summer, look for regular updates and our timeline for final plans to be distributed, likely fall at about late July, early August, when we're able to communicate those plans to families. We have a number of references that are listed here. And again, this is just additional evidence and resources that we rely upon as we build out our plans. We will continue to do that. Our summer planning team will as well. And I just want to close with a sincere thank you. I am so appreciative of the time you have taken, not only this evening to learn more about our planning, but to support your students throughout this entire unusual fourth quarter of the school year. I have been humbled by the incredible efforts of our students, of our staff, and of our families. That partnership in support of the work that we do is truly appreciated. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and for all your hard work and support throughout fourth quarter. We look forward to celebrating the end of the school year with each and every one of you. I know that our schools have some special plans over the next 5 days to help celebrate and honor our students and their efforts along with staff members, and we hope that proves to be a very special time for your family. With that, I thank you so much, and we will be signing off for this evening. Be well, everyone.